if we follow the news closely, the ongoing social unrest and the political struggles are taking place in China nationwide. On one hand, people are asking, what about this zero COVID policy today? And is it still becoming more effective or has become one of the political weapons that actually hurts the political base in China? But meanwhile, and what about the credibility of sitting Chinese President Xi Jinping? After attending the G20 Summit recently, Xi Jinping seemed to roll out this brand new strategy, not only towards the political changes in China, and also there's economic factors. In addition to all of that, you follow the news that former U.S. President Donald Trump recently claimed he's returning to the presidential race for the year of 2024. Is this a piece of good news for China, or maybe something that China will be unprepared? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, is Bob Davis. Bob Davis has covered U.S. China relations since the 1990s when the two nations were working hard to strengthen their ties. In 2022, Davis retired from the Wall Street Journal as a senior editor in Washington, D.C. after 39 years at the newspaper. And of course, if you follow his work in 2020, and he came out with a brand new book called Superpower Showdown, How the Battle Between Trump and Xi Threatens a New Cold War. And in this episode, we're going to talk to Bob regarding all those critical matters, not only within China, and also outside this nation. Well, Bob, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Well, thanks. Thanks very much for the invitation. Happy to be here.
Well, Bob, I have to say that after 39 years at the newspaper, again, it's my honor to invite such a distinguished journalist like you to join the show. Now, let's talk about the ongoing political and social unrest took place in the past 48 hours in China. Again, I'm sure you follow the news closely. Nationwide, the protests that took place, and not only people were chanting down with Xi Jinping, and also people were questioning the credibility of this Communist Party and also this ruling and this zero COVID policy. Putting everything together, Bob, how would you understand or how would you interpret today's political change and also this unrest in China?
Well, I mean, it's just an enormous challenge for the party and for the government. Probably the greatest challenge they faced politically, I imagine, since Tiananmen Square. But and it's nowhere. Let's keep things in perspective. I mean, it's nowhere near the kind of nationwide protest for democracy that occurred before the Tiananmen Square crackdown. However, what makes it particularly complicated, it isn't just that people want democracy, freedom, or truth from their government. There's a virus here, right? I mean, it's like the party can do what the party does. The party can crack down. The party can, censor people's views. They can do all sorts of things. But it's not even the same as was in Hong Kong, right? Where you had, a million people out on the street. But there, again, you could crack down, you could arrest people, you could expel people, but you can't expel a vaccine. I mean, they imagined that coronavirus would be a very different sort of medical challenge that it was. They have not gotten remotely a handle on it. People are just frustrated. I mean, anywhere people would be frustrated. And you see, I mean, at least today, the party was making little kind of concessions, modifications, but, we got a long way to go.
Well, Bob, as we mentioned in the intro, now recently Xi Jinping just came back from attending the G20 Summit. Now, only during the summit, he had a 3-hour-long conversation with the sitting U.S. President Joe Biden, and also he met up with a lot more international leaders, particularly in Southeast Asia. Now, going back to another piece of news that we know that after this 20th congressional meeting, Xi Jinping got confirmed for his third-term presidential run and also his presidency. Now, Bob, how would you think that this ongoing political and social unrest can actually hurt the credibility of Xi Jinping? And what about his policy? Now, from your perspective, do you think that he's willing to sacrifice some of the political agenda in order to keep this social stability, or his focus is still going to be centered on political strength or political base in order to make the noises louder? So what do you think?
Well, again, if it was just a political, I think the question would be pretty easy to answer. If it was just politics, if it was just a democratic movement, I think there's no doubt it would be pure repression, right? I mean, they try to do it with as little violence as they can manage, but it would be repression would be the 100% answer. This one is just more difficult. I mean, Xi Jinping, if you remember, when COVID first started, the pandemic was in its really particularly frightening stages. One of the few things he gave Li Keqiang, his number two, supposedly his number two, he was never even told his number two. It's like, oh, here, you get COVID. you get to handle COVID. I'll take care of everything else, because it was such a hot potato. It was so difficult to figure out how to deal with it, and the backlash against it was going to be enormous, no matter who had it. But since then, he has staked his reputation on handling COVID. And so it is difficult for him to back away from it. I think he'll have to, in some way, modify it, presumably by not admitting publicly that he had made mistakes. But it's a tough thing to manage. Remember, the obvious answer for what the Chinese ought to do is to import much more efficient vaccines and to ease enormously the restrictions on people's movement. However, you do that and a lot more people are going to get sick and a lot more people are going to die. It is not as if the United States and Europe handled COVID well. They didn't. We have more immunity in this country because so many people got sick and so many people died. So it isn't like there's a great, easy choice out there. It's a very difficult choice. From my perspective, I think what happened was the party took such a beating with their very, very bad response to SARS. SARS, they were too late. They hid the truth, the usual, their usual MO. But it broadly recognized that they did a terrible job. So this time they locked everybody up as fast as they could. They're draconian in the measures that they took, but it's a different kind of disease. SARS, you could lock people up, put them in their apartments, and it goes away. This one comes back in any number of different permutations, and it's just not gone.
Bob, I have one more question for you before we move on to talk about your book. And what about the reaction from the people? Again, throughout the media, we've seen people were chanting, the slogans such as "Down with Xi Jinping" or "We want more freedom" and we don't want to lock down. Again, it's not just about the people living in Beijing, but actually it's nationwide. And also, a lot more younger generations today are very vocal and also are questioning if this restriction or lockdown are actually becoming effective. But most importantly, that more and more younger people today are very bold to stand up against the policies and also against this authority. Now, Bob, from your perspective, how effective do you think it's going to become for this younger generation continue to voice opposition towards the Communist Party or towards the Communist Party's policies? That's number one. And number two, what kind of message should we understand by looking at the actions of the younger generations today in China?
Well, first of all, it's just incredibly brave, right? People can get thrown into jail. God knows what happens to them in jail, linger in jail forever. So first of all, it's just very, very brave. It's kind of on a par with what's happening in Iran, with the young women and young people in Iran. It's just, you take your hats off to them. It's really something. If it becomes an anti-party protest, it's probably going to, wind up in repression. I don't see any way around it. If it is, aimed more at the lockdowns, and less at Xi Jinping, I think it's inevitable. Of course, it's inevitable that the party has to move. They can't keep the place locked up forever, right? It's impossible because the economy would tank, and they care about that also. So yes, they'll have to move. So the question would be, can they move adroitly enough so that it mollifies, basically mollifies enough of the population so that it's, kind of short-lived, essentially. They kind of get what they want, even if they don't get the satisfaction of, the party admitting that it made mistakes. So it's a big challenge, but I wouldn't overplay. It's also funny. It's kind of one of the effects in China of the enormous censorship that they have for years and years. So I imagine many of those young people don't know anything about Tiananmen Square and don't know anything about the soldiers, shooting protesters there. A lot of, what was happened in Hong Kong was shut off, to people in the mainland. And plus, as you know, people in the mainland in general don't have high regard for people in Hong Kong, or didn't, at least, because they felt that people in Hong Kong thought they were better than people in the mainland. But still, I think they're concerned. They should be concerned if they're young protesters about what might happen, but they also don't have the memory, for better or worse, of the kind of military action that can be taken against people in China.
And Bob,
just one last thing.
Sure.
Back to Tiananmen Square. If those soldiers in that square hadn't fired on the protesters and had fired at Zhongnanhai, that would have been the end of the regime, right? I mean, you have soldiers are people, right. And, the people and the policemen and the soldiers and the security people who come out, to enforce what the party's doing, they have, they're affected. They have mothers and fathers who are affected. They have cousins and broader clan. It is ultimately about people, and whether the people in security will follow, the leader. So far, I mean, we're nowhere close to seeing that not happen. But that ultimately is the staying power of any regime, is whether it commands enough respect from the population and from the security officials that execute their orders or don't execute their orders.
That's right, Bob. And also what matters the worst, it's really seeing those officials or police officers that they blindly followed the regulations or followed the rules that without actually knowing the truth behind those orders. But anyway, I'm very much interested to dive into the conversation regarding your book. Again, the book is called Superpower Showdown: How the Battle Between Trump and Xi Threatens a New Cold War. Bob, as we mentioned before, not too long ago, former U.S. President Donald Trump claimed that he's interested in running to be the president again for the country of United States of America in the year of 2024. Now, the first question, in terms of dealing with China, is this going to be a brand new piece of good news, or China needs to prepare another type of brand new strategy in order to deal with Trump's presidential election?
Well, he's running, but let's not assume that he's going to win. So first off, yes, he's running. China will be inevitably a big part for Trump. It'll be one of the big campaign issues that he'll bring up. He'll say that, whatever you think of what Biden has done, and we can talk about it, he'll say that Biden's been too weak. The Chinese, if I had been president, the Chinese wouldn't have done this, the Chinese wouldn't have done that. And China becomes both kind of an economic stalking horse for concerns Americans have about the economy and things not going very well. But in addition, it becomes kind of a symbol, essentially, a symbol that the elites in America, the government in America, and the media and business have turned their back on ordinary Americans and, favored China and let China run, roughshod all over the world. That's the way he'll phrase it. So China will be a big part of any election campaign. Frankly, even if he doesn't win the nomination, the Republican nomination, any candidate on the Republican side is going to try to make China a big issue. Now, if he wins, Yeah, who knows? I mean, it's so hard to know with this guy. But yes, if I was sitting in Beijing, they have a lot to worry about at the moment. They don't have to worry about 2 years from now in a presidential election. But yes, he's totally unpredictable. But it's probably makes it even less likely. If he were to win, it would make it even less likely that you'd find any sort of reasonable engagement by these two countries.
Well, Bob, but again, there's something in your book that, I read particularly interested me the most is talking about this economy or this economic battle between U.S. and China. And this is something that you explained specifically in the book. But one thing we have to understand is after the confirmation for Xi Jinping's third term, and if we look at this brand new cabinet members that he brought on the stage, and he proudly introduced each one of them, and a lot more economic experts believe that for this time, or for this next following 4 to 5 years, that Xi Jinping is very much interested in shaping up this not only domestic, but also this international economic agenda. But on the other hand, going back to the book, we remember Donald Trump's background was not a politician, and he was the businessman, he was a celebrity, however you want to name it. But the truth is, to bring the middle class into the conversation, again, this is something you mentioned in the book, was one of the signatures for Donald Trump. And so in other words, that really was routed the entire crowd, the voters. So, Bob, from your perspective, help us to understand, regardless if Trump is going to become the next president or not, how much do you think that China is willing to work with the U.S. on this economic agenda or on this an economic negotiation? Because right now, even though people are saying Joe Biden and Xi Jinping met each other in during the G20 Summit, but so far we have not seen any progress, where we won't see any changes until another year or so. So from your perspective, how would you describe this economic deadlock right now, and how much change can we expect in the year of 2024, or maybe after this result of election?
I mean, the subtitle of our book was, threatens a new Cold War. I mean, I think we're in it. It's different than the one against the Soviet Union, but we're in the midst of it, or the beginning of it. I think what happened at the G20 is mostly that bad things didn't happen. That they put a kind of bottom. Things wouldn't get worse, and we wouldn't go to war. Things that almost seemed impossible 5, 6, 10, 7 years ago. Unimaginable, not impossible, unimaginable that the U.S. and China would actually go to an actual shooting war. I mean, it just seemed crazy. But we're at a point where that's imaginable now, and I think they wanted to make sure it didn't spill over into that, as badly as that. So it's good. Good day, God knows we don't need another war. So that's a positive thing. I think one positive you can take away from the G20. I think this is right, but it got a little bit of attention, but. Biden and Xi at least had a statement, although Xi didn't say it publicly, but he didn't deny it. That they said something to the effect that in Ukraine that there shouldn't be any use of nuclear weapons. Xi Jinping and the German chancellor had a statement similar. And interestingly, you do see President Putin in Russia, he has stopped talking about that, right? I mean, I think he would put out statements more recently saying, anybody who uses nuclear weapons would be, a fool. It would be, a disaster for the world. So maybe that was one of the positive results. I'm not sure if that, 100%, but it's possible. Other than that, I think, as I say, I put as what the Americans call guardrails on it, or the attempt to. But no, there's been nothing positive, nothing affirmative that's come out of it. I think you'd see it in two areas. In climate, I shouldn't say that. In climate, they've restarted some talk, so that's something. But that's an area, obviously, of common interest where you would need, the two biggest economies of the world to be working on it. That's one. But economics and trade play a very, very interesting role in all of this. So let's go back to when Nixon first went to China, right? This is 1974, was it, or 1972? I forget exactly what year. I should know this off the top of my head. But when he went to China China was in the midst of the Cultural Revolution.
That's right.
I mean, right? Maybe the worst human rights violation since the end of World War II. But still, there were other reasons. There were political and military reasons for Nixon to want to go to China. But so they had their economic and military reasons, which is basically to strike a somewhat quasi-alliance against the Soviet Union, or to put the Soviet Union, give them something more to worry about. But the way in which the two countries drew closer was through trade and economics, right? Because it seemed unemotional, right? It's just trade, right? It's not a question of, dealing with dissidents. It's not a question of human rights, or it didn't seem to be anyway. So it isn't really as unemotional as all that. There are all these other issues about law and rights and, a million things wrapped up into it. But that would be what you would expect if it's not going to be a Cold War. You would expect some movement in the trade area, some movement in economics and finance. So far, you don't see any of it. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but that's, I think, the area to look at. I think also, I know from the American perspective, they believe that even when it comes to climate, that the Chinese aren't really willing to move unless the U.S. makes concessions in other areas, on Taiwan or other areas of Chinese interest, where the American view is like, we can disagree on a million things, but, China, climate's in our interest. No matter what happens elsewhere, we should be working together. They claim that that's not what that's not the view in Beijing. So even in climate, they're really not making a hell of a lot of progress. There's a little bit. It's not, but again, things didn't get worse. That's basic outcome.
Bob, I know there's another chapter which related to what we called ping pong diplomacy. And you know that ping pong has been one of the favorite or national sports in China. And again, when we look at the ping pong sports, again, I'm not very good at playing ping pong, shamefully speaking. But I know a lot of people who are very much into the sports. But let's look at this phrase from this geopolitical standpoint. When we look at this ping pong diplomacy, as you mentioned in 1972, when Nixon arrived in China, and that was really the crucial period for the countries, again, to get to know each other. We always remember this image where Nixon shook hands with Chairman Mao, and then Zhou Enlai was the premier and sat down, had this conversation, the beautiful banquet, etc. But today, when we talk about this ping pong diplomacy, three words actually can be used. And number one is the word aggressiveness. And number two is the word strategy. And number three is the word fairness. Now, Bob, you dive into this in the chapters regarding this ping pong diplomacy. By looking the three words, how much do you think that today, when we look at this relationship between China and U.S., or between Xi Jinping and Biden, or in the future Xi Jinping with any other presidents in the U.S., do you think that today China seems to continue to be more aggressive, or continue to hold or push this wolf warrior diplomacy, or China, maybe it's time to think about we should be fair, we should be modest, at least we should be polite, maybe dial down this foreign policy towards the West or towards the rest of the world a little bit more. So how would you describe this at this moment?
I don't see any evidence that they're trying to be any less aggressive. I think they've been, aggressive. The alliance that they have with the Russians, from an American point of view, never made a hell of a lot of sense, to hitch your wagon to a country that is, an energy power, but that's it, and to alienate, even if they felt that the Americans were a lost cause, the Europeans, the countries that made you rich, really? You're going to be in opposition to all those countries? So, but that's not the way they look at it in Beijing, and I don't see any evidence that they're moving away from it. If anything, I think you alluded to it, is the people that he picked, that Xi Jinping picked for the Politburo Standing Committee they were obviously his cronies and his allies, but in addition, they were people who had some interest or some experience with technology and so on. And if you're sitting in Beijing, the Americans have been very aggressive when it comes to technology and industries of the future. What do they have to do? What do they feel they have to do? Which is to build up their domestic capabilities, because they're not getting any help from the Americans. If anything, there's even more sanctions coming down the road. So, I don't know. I think this is a really rough time in U.S. China, a really rough time. I don't see that it's going to get much better. I don't see that Biden's changing much. I think he may assess, as I say, more sanctions. You might see TikTok banned, which would be amazing. And some other things that in restrictions on American investment in China, not just Chinese investment in America. So there's a lot of things that could happen. Again, if I'm wrong, I mean, the area you would expect to see it would be in trade, that they maybe restart trade talks of some sort, or remove some of the tariffs. I mean, just removing the tariffs wouldn't make much of a difference, economically, but it would be a signal, that they intended to go in a different direction. We don't see any evidence of that at the moment. That's what I'd be looking for.
Bob, I know you're very busy.
It's interesting you mentioned ping pong diplomacy. I mean, back then it was different in the sense that, the U.S. had cut off China from so much of the world, right? And there was so much of a mystery about what was in China, and there's a very long history of Americans being very interested in China, a lot of Chinese Americans. So you had all of that, just the mystique. Well, the mystique's gone, I mean, people have been able, in a good way, people have been able to, travel to China. Chinese people have been able to travel, to America and Europe. So that sort of thing, playing on, kind of the mystique, it just won't work anymore. Everybody knows, it's not just ping pong, so it's just different times.
That's right. Well, Bob, I know you're very busy. I got two more questions before letting you go. Let's talk about one of the signatory achievement for Xi Jinping now, which is the Belt and Road Initiative. But right now, at this moment, and given the fact that today the pandemic completely changed the entire world, and also a lot more countries who are politically vulnerable and also financially unstable, they were looking for ways to seek better relationship with China under this Belt and Road Initiative. But right now, more and more economists and also political scientists begin to question the motive and also the effectiveness of Belt and Road Initiative. Now, Bob, from your perspective, after all those years of reporting on China, how much do you think does the Belt and Road Initiative hold in terms of collecting the resources and also solidifying the credibility of the Communist Party? And also, what about this payback or this tit-for-tat deal between China with some of the countries? So what can we make of that?
I thought it was a really brilliant strategy to start with, right? I mean, China didn't have the web of alliances that the United States does, right? And so to try to figure out a way to sweep in a whole variety of countries, even make inroads into Europe, was, I thought, really a brilliant idea. But I don't think they've and also it was a way to, in theory anyway, a way to use Chinese companies that we're reaching market saturation, so you could imagine expanding their market reach. But I think they've carried it out really poorly. And if you're going to be a global player and you're going to be dealing with poor countries, you have to have some idea of what's going to happen when these countries can't pay. I don't think, I could be wrong, but I don't think the Chinese went into it thinking, oh, we're gonna pick up a port in Sri Lanka. I'm not sure that they really needed that port or wanted a particular port there. I think they would have rather have been paid back, and so they're in any number of situations where they may not get paid back. It's not a country that has thought much, it's not a government that has thought much about what happens, when you need debt relief, when you need to give debt relief. So some of it that seems sort of Machiavellian, I think, is just incompetence. And they're in a very difficult situation. The United States, has a lot of experience, hard-won experience, in Latin America, where they did, sort of something similar. The idea didn't have a fancy name, but the idea was kind of to tie Latin America to the United States. With investments, the links to the dollars and all that. And then most of Latin America, periodically goes broke. And then, then what do you do with all the debt? And what happens is, unless you figure out ways to write it down, those countries can never repay you back. And it is not a it's not a positive. It's a negative. You lose your money. You piss off the other countries that are in debt. You don't wind up with more allies. And I think that's the situation, that China finds itself in now.
Bob, I want to wrap up our conversation by going back to your book. Again, since we mentioned that Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, this threatens a new Cold War, but ultimately, at the end of the day, people are thinking about the word legacy. People are wondering that what kind of legacy that Xi Jinping is trying to build. Because if we look at all the predecessors, like Hu Jintao or Deng Xiaoping or Chen Mao, however you name it, I think every single person left different stories or different either reality, or we can look at this imaginative descriptions for each generations. But now, since Xi Jinping became the leader for China, and also after all those years that through ups and downs, so Bob, from your perspective, what kind of legacy or what kind of stories do you think that Xi Jinping is trying to build or hoping to build, not only for the domestic audience, but also internationally regarding his projects and his policies and political changes or ambitions, etc.?
I think he's been very clear about it. It's a national rejuvenation of the Chinese people, of China's place in the world. I think he wants to have, by the time he leaves, China to be the leading power in the world, or right there with the United States. I think he's been very, very clear about that, and I think the United States doesn't want that to happen. And that is where the conflict comes in, right? I mean, it's for any incumbent power, the United States, no incumbent power wants to give up its position. But if you're giving up your position to a country that doesn't seem to be a threat, well, that's one thing, right? When England was the leading country and then America became, took its place, it didn't end in a war, I mean, it just kind of the way things worked. It was America was a more dynamic and bigger economic power. If China was seen in a neutral kind of way, it would be difficult for the Americans, but it wouldn't be as frightening. I mean, what's frightening is Xi Jinping's idea that China would be the leading power, or at least right next to the leading power, and also be antagonistic to the United States. So that's where the fear comes in. But I think Xi Jinping's been very clear from the beginning. His China dream, the rejuvenation, I think it's exactly what he wants.
And of course, that for Xi Jinping, he still has a long way to go in order to complete his third-term presidency. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Bob Davis. And again, Bob Davis has covered U.S. China relations since the 1990s, when the two nations were working hard to strengthen their ties. And of course, I strongly encourage everyone to go online and look for Bob's new book. It's called The Superpower Showdown: How the Battle Between Trump and Xi Threatens a New Cold War. Bob, again, thank you so much for taking your time to be on the show. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. And again, it's an honor to have such a distinguished journalist like you to help us to understand the ongoing political changes in China and also around the world. Thank you so much for doing this.
No, thank you. It's been a pleasure.